In February 1959, a group of 9 hikers set out into the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. On maps, the area looked like an ordinary mountain pass. But in winter, this place became a landscape with almost no margin for error. The wind shifted direction without warning, visibility vanished within minutes, and the cold slowed not only the body, but the mind itself. These people were not inexperienced. Among them were university students, engineers, and hikers who had already completed difficult winter expeditions. They knew their equipment. They knew how fast the cold could kill. This was not a group that underestimated nature. They did not return on the scheduled date. At first, this caused no alarm. Delays were common in this region. But as the days passed, the silence became disturbing. Families grew worried. Authorities were notified. Search and rescue teams were sent out despite the harsh conditions. Days later, the tent was found on the mountainside. It was still standing. It was not buried by snow. It had not been blown away by the wind. From a distance, it looked like an abandoned camp. But up close, one detail immediately stood out. The tent entrance had not been used. The zipper was untouched. Instead, the fabric had been cut open in several places, and the cuts were made from the inside. This detail was critical. It suggested that whoever was inside did not have time to exit the tent normally. This was not an organized evacuation. This was a sudden escape. Inside the tent, the situation became even stranger. Shoes were still there. Jackets, gloves, and personal belongings were neatly left behind. Food was unfinished. Everything suggested that only minutes earlier the group had still been inside the tent. Yet 9 people had stepped out into the night into temperatures approaching -25°C. Footprints were clearly visible in the snow. 9 sets of tracks, some made in socks, some with only one shoe, but the tracks were not chaotic. There were no signs of running, no frantic movements. The footprints showed a controlled walk downhill. This raised a single disturbing question. Under what circumstances does a person walk calmly into a freezing night without even putting on their shoes? The first bodies were found at the tree line. Someone had tried to start a small fire. Branches were broken. Some had been snapped from heights that suggested one of them had climbed a tree, likely to gather wood or see farther. There were burn marks on some hands, but the bodies were frozen. Their faces showed exhaustion, not panic. Farther down the slope, more bodies were found. They were lying in the direction of the tent as if trying to return, but at some point their strength had failed. In this region, the cold does not kill slowly. At a certain point, it simply takes over. The most disturbing discovery came weeks later when 3 bodies were recovered from beneath the snow. Their chest cavities were severely damaged. Ribs were crushed inward. One victim had a major skull fracture, yet there were almost no external injuries. No cuts, no bruises. Forensic reports described the damage as the result of high-pressure impact. This was not something that could be explained by a fight or a simple fall. One female hiker was missing her tongue. Her eye tissue was also severely damaged. Official reports explained this as a post-mortem effect of natural processes. Still, this detail stayed with everyone who studied the case, because it did not fit the pattern of a typical hypothermia death. Even more troubling was another finding. Radiation was detected on some of the clothing. The levels were not lethal. No one died from radiation poisoning. But that was not the point. The problem was this: radiation should not have been there at all. Not every piece of clothing showed radiation. Only certain items. And notably, they belonged to 2 of the hikers. It was suggested that these individuals may have previously worked near nuclear facilities. But this explanation was never considered sufficient. That type of exposure would not normally leave traces like these. What made it stranger was that radiation was found on the clothing itself, not in the surrounding environment, not in the snow, not in the soil, not near the tent. This meant the group had not simply passed through a radioactive area. Something had either passed close to them, or they had come very close to something. This detail remained only a brief note in the case file. It was never pursued. In 1959 Soviet Union, radiation was not just a scientific term. It meant nuclear testing, secret facilities, state secrets. Asking too many questions meant closing the file. After months of investigation, the case was officially closed. The final conclusion was a single sentence: the influence of an unknown force of nature. No explanation of what kind of force. No clarification. The file was closed. The questions remained. That is when the theories began. One of the most discussed possibilities was secret Soviet military testing. In 1959, the Cold War was at its peak. Experimental weapons, including air-detonated munitions and parachute mines, were being tested. These devices did not always produce loud explosions, but they could generate powerful shockwaves capable of causing severe internal injuries without leaving visible marks on the body. The internal trauma, the sudden abandonment of the tent, and the decision to flee all aligned disturbingly well with this theory. There was no definitive proof, but the conditions of the era made it difficult to dismiss. Another detail seemed to support this possibility. Around the same time, reports emerged of strange lights in the sky. Orange, silent, slowly moving objects. Different witnesses in different locations reported similar sightings. What they were was never confirmed. But seeing something unexplained in the night sky could have a profound psychological effect on people on the ground. Another theory focused on something invisible: infrasound. Infrasound refers to low-frequency sound waves that humans cannot consciously hear. Under certain wind and terrain conditions, mountains can generate these frequencies. Research shows that infrasound can cause sudden anxiety, a feeling of pressure in the chest, disorientation, and an overwhelming urge to flee. According to this theory, what happened that night was not something the group saw or heard. It was something they felt, an unexplained alarm, a sense that something was deeply wrong. This could explain why the tent was cut open. The decision was not logical, it was reflexive. The effect of infrasound can be temporary. Once the environment changes, the sensation can fade. This could explain why the group later stopped to start a fire at the tree line. But by then, the cold had already pushed their bodies past the point of recovery. And then there is the most unsettling explanation of all: group panic. Group panic does not mean everyone panics at once. It begins with one person's hesitation affecting the judgment of the others. When someone says, "Something is wrong," no one asks why, because there is no time. In the mountains, uncertainty itself becomes the greatest threat. There was a leader, Igor Dyatlov, experienced, calm. But sometimes, even a moment of hesitation from a leader can destabilize an entire group. We do not know what was said that night, but we know this: at some point all 9 people made the same decision, to leave the tent without proper clothing. The orderly footprints suggest this was not chaotic panic. This was quiet compliance with fear. Walking downhill makes sense in that context. Seeking shelter, seeking safety. A decision based on limited information but not an irrational one. Trying to start a fire at the tree line suggests the initial pressure had eased. The mind may have regained control, but the body had already begun to fail. Those who attempted to return to the tent represent the moment the mistake was realized. And by then it was too late. Looking back at the Dyatlov Pass case, the mistake may have been trying to explain everything with a single cause. The evidence points instead to multiple overlapping failures, an unseen pressure, an unexplained trace, and a fragile human response under extreme uncertainty. There was no monster here, no supernatural force, but there were false alarms, and that is what makes Dyatlov Pass truly frightening. Because under the same conditions, with the same lack of information, others might have made the same choices. Perhaps that is why this case never truly closed. Because Dyatlov Pass reminds us that disasters are not always caused by one catastrophic mistake, but by several small decisions that cannot be undone. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in history is simple: acting without certainty.